Nobody thought much about the old piano when they were clearing out the house. It had been sitting in the back room for as long as anyone could remember. A dark, upright piano pushed against the wall, slightly out of tune, with a small stack of handwritten pages resting on top of it. The neighbors had heard it being played for years. Every evening, around 8 o'clock, the soft sound of music would drift through the walls. They had never thought to ask about it. People mind their own business. That's just how things are. But when Daniel passed away that winter, quietly, in his sleep, the way people who have lived careful and private lives often do, his younger sister Margaret came to the house to sort through his belongings. She was sick. She hadn't been inside that back room in years. And when she pushed open the door and looked around, she expected to find sheet music, maybe a few old books. What she found instead changed everything she thought she knew about her brother. Under the piano bench, tucked away like something that was never meant to be found, was a leather journal. Old, worn down at the corners. The kind of journal you buy when you mean something by it. Margaret picked it up and turned it over in her hands. The leather was soft from years of use. On the inside cover, in Daniel's neat, careful handwriting, were 3 words. For the music, she sat down right there on the floor, not even bothering to find a chair, and she started reading. Daniel had been a mathematics teacher for 31 years at a secondary school in Edinburgh. To everyone who knew him, he was the kind of person you'd describe as reliable. Steady. He marked papers on time, remembered students' names years after they left, made decent tea, and never caused any trouble. He lived alone. He didn't talk much about his personal life, and nobody pushed him on it. Some people are just private. You accept that and move on. But the journal told a different story. The first entry was dated 1976. Daniel would have been 24 years old. The handwriting was younger, slightly messier, more rushed. Like he was writing quickly before the feeling passed, and at the very top of the page, before anything else, was a name. Claire. Margaret stared at it for a moment. She turned the page. Another entry. Same name at the top. She kept going. Page after page, year after year, every single entry in that journal began with the name Claire. Not dear Claire. Not a letter. Who's the name? Sitting there at the top of the page, like a quiet dedication. Like he was writing to her, even when he wasn't writing to her. Margaret counted the entries later. There were over 200 of them, spanning 43 years. Through those pages, a story slowly came together. Claire Ashworth was someone Daniel had met at university in the autumn of 1974. She was studying music piano performance, specifically, and he was studying mathematics. They were in the same social group for exactly 1 semester before Claire transferred to a music conservatory in London. 1 semester, about 4 months. That was all the time they had actually spent in the same city, in the same rooms, breathing the same air. But the way Daniel wrote about those 4 months, you would think a whole lifetime had happened inside them. He wrote about ordinary things, mostly. The kind of details that don't seem important at the time, but somehow get burned into your memory anyway. He wrote about a walk they took along the canal on a Tuesday afternoon when it started raining and Claire laughed, instead of running for cover. He wrote about borrowing her umbrella once and forgetting to give it back for 3 weeks. He wrote about sitting across from her in the university canteen and watching her hum to herself while she ate, completely unaware that anyone was listening. Small things. Quiet things. The kind of things that only matter because of who was doing them. He wrote about a piece of music she played once, in a practice room, when she didn't know he was standing in the hallway. He never found out what the piece was called. He described it only as the one that sounded like morning, and that was enough for him. He wrote about it in 3 separate entries over the years, still trying to put into words what it had felt like to stand there in that corridor and hear her play. What he never wrote about, not once, was telling her. He never told Claire how he felt. He never asked her to stay when she left for London. He wrote about the day she told him she was transferring with a kind of calm that Margaret found almost painful to read, like he had already decided, somewhere deep down, that some feelings are yours to keep and not to share. He saw her off at the bus station. She hugged him. He said he hoped London treated her well, and then she was gone. That was November 1974. The journal entries began in 1976, almost 2 years later. As if he had spent that time trying to let it go, and then simply given up trying. But here is the part that Margaret couldn't stop thinking about. long after she had closed the journal and sat in the quiet of that room. It wasn't just the words. Tucked between the pages, in envelopes folded and paper clipped to the entries, were handwritten music sheets, compositions. Daniel had been writing music, actual pieces for piano, all alongside the journal entries, and every single one of them had a title. The way she laughed at rain. Her coat on the lecture hall chair. The last morning before she left. More than 40 pieces in total. Some of them were only 8 bars long. Some stretched to 4 or 5 pages. Daniel had never studied music formally. He had simply taught himself, quietly, in that back room, over the course of decades, and every piece he ever wrote was a memory, a moment, a detail about a woman he had known for 4 months, 50 years ago, and never stopped thinking about. Margaret sat with the journal until the room got cold and the light outside faded. She didn't move. She just kept turning pages. At some point, she realized she was crying, not loudly, not dramatically. Just the quiet kind of crying that happens when you understand something about a person you loved and didn't fully know. She had grown up with Daniel. She had eaten at his table, called him on his birthday, argued with him about small and stupid things, the way siblings do, and she had never once known about any of this. He had carried it completely alone, for his entire adult life, without ever asking for a single thing in return. She set the journal down gently on the piano bench. She looked at the piano, and then she did something she hadn't planned on doing at all. She decided she was going to find Claire. Finding someone you haven't seen in 50 years is not as simple as it sounds. Margaret didn't have a last name to start with. The journal never mentioned one. Daniel had always just written Claire, as if there was only one person in the world that name could belong to. So Margaret started with what she had. She went back through the entries and pulled out every small detail Daniel had ever written down. Claire had studied piano performance. She had transferred to a conservatory in London in late 1974. She had grown up somewhere in the north of England. There was a mention of a train journey home at Christmas, and the way Daniel described the route suggested it was a long one. It wasn't much, but it was something. Margaret posted in an alumni group from Daniel's old university, keeping it vague, just asking if anyone remembered a music student named Claire from that era. She contacted the university's records office, though they couldn't share personal information, and she hadn't really expected them to. She searched online in the quiet way people do when they're not entirely sure they have the right to be looking, clicking through old pages, trying different combinations of words. Then, 11 days after she started looking, a woman replied to her alumni post. She said she had been a music student at the conservatory in London in the mid. She remembered a Claire Ashworth, who had come from Edinburgh for 1 year before leaving to get married. She didn't know what had become of her after that, but the name was real. It matched, and now Margaret had something solid to work with. It took another week, but eventually, through a chain of small leads that each opened up the next one, she found her. Claire Ashworth, now Claire Bevan, after her late husband, was living in Bristol. She was 70 years old. She had been widowed in 2015. She worked part-time teaching piano to young children, mostly on weekday afternoons, in the front room of her terraced house. She had 2 grown children and 3 grandchildren, and by all appearances she had built a full and quiet life for herself. The kind of life that looks ordinary from the outside and means everything to the person living it. Margaret wrote her a letter, not an email, a proper letter, handwritten. Because it felt wrong to send something like this into someone's inbox, between a utility bill and a newsletter. She explained who she was. She explained about Daniel, and that he had passed away. She said she had found something she believed Claire should know about, and that she was sorry to arrive in her life this way, out of nowhere, and she would completely understand if Claire chose not to respond. She posted it on a Thursday morning. She told herself she might not hear anything back. She tried to prepare for that possibility. Claire called her that same Saturday. Margaret said later that she nearly didn't answer, because she didn't recognize the number, but something made her pick up, and the voice on the other end was calm and measured. The kind of voice that belongs to someone who has learned, over a long life, how to hold themselves steady. Claire said she had read the letter 3 times. She said she remembered Daniel. Of course, she remembered him. And then she said something that Margaret turned over in her mind for a long time afterwards. She said, "I always wondered if he felt what I felt. I supposed I would never know." Margaret didn't say anything for a moment. Then she asked if Claire would be willing to come to Edinburgh. She came the following Saturday. She took the train up on her own, which Margaret thought was either very brave or the act of someone who had already decided something before they even arrived. They met at the house, Daniel's house, which Margaret was still in the process of sorting through. She made tea. They sat in the kitchen first, two women in their 70s who had never met, connected by a man they had both loved in completely different ways. Claire was smaller than Margaret imagined. Neat. White-haired. She had the kind of stillness about her that you sometimes see in people who have spent their lives listening carefully. Which made sense, Margaret supposed, for someone who had spent decades teaching music to children. They talked for a while before Margaret brought out the journal. She didn't want to just hand it over immediately. It felt too abrupt, like dropping something heavy into someone's hands without warning. So they talked first. Claire spoke about her husband, who had died of an illness after a long marriage. She spoke about her children. She asked about Daniel's life, what he had been like as a person, whether he had been happy, whether he had had people around him. Margaret answered, honestly, he had been content, she thought. Steady. He had good colleagues and a few close friends. He had not been lonely in any obvious way, but there had always been something in him that was held back, something she had never been able to name until she read the journal. Now, she understood it. Then she brought out the journal and placed it on the table between them. Claire picked it up slowly. She opened it to the first page and read the first entry. Then she turned to another page, somewhere in the middle. Then to one near the end. She didn't read every word. She wasn't reading it so much as taking it in. The way you look at something that requires a moment before you can fully understand what you're seeing. Then Margaret took out her phone. She had a short recording on it. She hadn't planned to record it. It had happened by accident, during a family visit a few years earlier, when she had been filming something in the garden and Daniel hadn't realized she could hear him through the open window. 37 seconds of him playing piano, alone in his back room, not knowing anyone was listening. She pressed play. The sound that came out of that phone speaker was quiet and slightly tinny, the way phone recordings always are. But it was unmistakably him, unhurried, gentle, playing something that didn't have a name that Margaret knew, something he had written himself. She watched Claire listen to it. She watched her face do something that was difficult to describe. Not breaking down, not dramatic. Just the kind of recognition, slow and private, like hearing a word in a language you haven't spoken in a very long time and realizing your mouth still knows the shape of it. When the recording ended, Claire didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, he remembered. He actually remembered all of it. Margaret let the silence sit. There was nothing to add to that. Before she left that evening, Claire asked if she could take the journal home with her. Margaret had already decided she would say yes. It had never really belonged to the house, she thought. It had always been meant for somewhere else. Over the months that followed, Claire did something that nobody had asked her to do and nobody could have predicted. She learned Daniel's compositions, all of them. Every handwritten piece tucked into those journal pages, from the shortest 8-bar sketches to the longer ones that ran to 4 and 5 pages. She sat at her piano in Bristol and learned them one by one, the way she might have learned any piece of music, except that these ones had titles like the way she laughed at rain and her coat on the lecture hall chair, and she knew, as she played them, that she was the reason they existed. She began performing them at small local recitals. Notting Grand, a community hall, a church, a music evening at the local library. Before each performance, she would introduce the pieces the same way, in the same quiet words. She would say, these were written by a man named Daniel. He played them alone, in a small room, for 40 years. I think it's time someone heard them. She never told the full story to the audiences. She didn't feel it was necessary. The music said enough on its own. But people always went very still when she played. The kind of still that happens when something reaches you without warning and you don't quite have words for it yet. And afterwards, Mortanon says someone would come up to her and say they weren't sure why, but the music had made them think of someone they hadn't thought about in years, someone they had never told. Claire would nod. She understood exactly what they meant. Daniel never knew that his music would be heard. He never knew that Claire would sit down at a piano and play the sound of his memories back into the world. He had spent 40 years writing in a room by himself, for an audience of no one, because that was simply what loving someone had meant for him, not possession. not pursuit. Just this, a quiet and faithful act of remembering, done without any expectation that it would ever amount to anything at all. And maybe that's the thing about love that doesn't get said enough. It doesn't always need to go anywhere. Sometimes it just needs somewhere to live. Daniel gave us a room, and a piano, and 40 years of evenings. And in the end, even after he was gone, it found its way to exactly where it had always been going.